I should probably just stop. And that would be enough. I don't know if anything struck you in hearing that, but the thing that struck me is, wow, suffering is like a sheepdog, nipping at our heels, driving us toward Calvary. Is it? Or let's put, can it be? You know, Dave mentioned the verse earlier about all things working out for good. I'll get to that in a minute. That's not a guarantee. There's a few stipulations along with it. But isn't that a scary thought that our suffering may be like a sheepdog driving us to the cross, the foot of the cross, a place where we don't want to go? Any truth in that? Why don't you say, what keeps us from going to the foot of the cross? A spiritual pride. Last week I showed those pictures, the one with the self on the throne. That's bad. You know, we often have trouble making sense out of suffering, but here you have somebody who, with Johnny Erickson, is making sense out of it. But what's interesting is, she didn't lose track of how many days she's been in that wheelchair. She hasn't dismissed it, hasn't checked it out. It's a very real part of her existence. Doesn't like it. She said she wanted wheelchair to go to hell. I mean, so obviously there wasn't this kind of like, oh, yippee, I'm so lucky to have it. But there was some type of process. You know, as I said, we have trouble making sense out of suffering. You know, I'm sure that man in our text that was born blind had a horrible difficulty making sense of why. How many times do we ask that question? Why is this happening with my kids? Why is this happening with me? Why is this happening with my church? Why is this happening with the denomination? Why is this? Why? I've asked it repeatedly. Why? I think part of the problem is perception. When we read in our story about the man born blind, those who were sitting on the throne, the religious leaders, the Pharisee types, their perspective was there's something wrong with the fellow. Yet from Jesus' perspective, put that picture with Christ on the throne. This is from last week. From that perspective, it made complete, total sense. So part of the making sense of suffering is, whose perspective do we have to look at in terms of suffering that's occurring? From God's perspective, that man that was born blind, he is probably, tormented when he'd hear the whispers. Oh, well, yeah, his family's sinned. Yeah, you know that much. That family's like that. We know all about them. But now on the other side, we saw it from God's perspective. How do you think he's sitting in heaven like, wow, my story, my suffering is in that book? Do you think maybe it's a joyous thing now? Where he's saying, yeah, maybe. Okay, if I would have known that. So the perspective is we try to make sense of suffering through our lens where we were on the throne, the one with the self on the throne versus Christ being on the throne. It can be problematic. You see, it's not until Jesus gets on the throne of our life that we begin to start making sense of suffering. If we look at it from a worldly perspective, that all that matters is how are things going? Am I getting ahead? Am I popular? Am I rich? Am I prosperous? Suffering makes no sense. Does it? It makes no sense. Laying in a hospital bed, have stuff popped in you. Having doctors do horrible stuff to you, almost take you to the brink of death to save you. Doesn't make any sense, does it? From a human perspective. But when we begin to see things from the perspective of Jesus on the throne, it changes. See, the text that we read about with Paul when he talks about that all God works for good, it's for those who love Him. There's a lot of people that broke their neck like Johnny Harrison, who are bitter, who are angry, who are stuck in addiction. But what enables a person to see the suffering as something positive? It's the loving of God. Trying to figure out suffering from our own human perspective will leave us bitter. It will leave us angry. If I try to look at why do I have to have a house foreclosed? Why do I have to have a business fail? Why do I have to have my name put in the newspaper, be maligned from a human perspective? I'd still be bitter. But on the other side, that maybe God had some type of plan that may be impacting others, it changes it from bitterness to joy. And how many of you have been through a trial when you've seen what God is using it for, your grief turns to joy? There has to be a couple. And we would think, how could that possibly happen? I think it's back to the power of God. The man left that was born blind could have been left bitter. But it doesn't appear that he was left bitter, does it? When after he was healed, he could have, what about all those years I missed? I didn't get to do what other kids did. My childhood was robbed. But he got to see the encounter with the living God. And we know he became a disciple because later when he's talking to the Pharisees, they're questioning him and he goes, do you want to become a disciple too? Meaning he was a disciple, wanted to know if they want to become one. And their response is like, don't talk that God stuff to me. If you see, there's only one way to make sense of suffering, and that is to have Jesus on the throne. Because the sense of the suffering is not from our perspective. Making sense of it is making sense of it from God's perspective. And unless we are seeking God's perspective in all things, we cannot make sense of these things. You follow what I'm talking about? We have to have Jesus on the throne. The biblical description of a believer or disciple is this: Christ on the throne. When we hear disciples, that's the depiction where Christ is reigning on the throne in someone's life. As I said, making sense of suffering requires that we seek God's perspective. There are a number of years of Johnny Harrison where she wanted to end her life. Because from her perspective, it was a waste. But she was so disabled, she couldn't even get it done. And it wasn't until that shift occurred that what is Jesus' purpose, what is God's purpose, that the suffering gets turned into something. You see, God does want to turn all those things to good. He really does. But as Paul says, and if we don't seek it from God's perspective, our suffering, we will become bitter, we will become angry, we will feel like God cheated us, we'll say it's not fair, and we'll become downright hostile, won't we? And then what's really bad, we'll become jealous of the person who has found peace. Ever had that when you find somebody who's found peace over something that you're still in torment over? You don't have to raise your hand, but I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about. That's why when Paul proclaims in Romans 8:28, he says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him,